In this video, we'll discuss what's required to start developing with Xamarin. Now first, you can use either a Mac or a Windows PC as your development machine, and depending on your development environment, you'll be able to target different mobile platforms. Mac allows you to target iOS, Android, and Mac OS, and Windows lets you target iOS, Android, and of course, Windows. Installing Xamarin on Windows can be done from the Visual Studio installer, either 2015 or better yet, 2017. And you can even use the free Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition. And if you don't have Visual Studio installed yet, then the Xamarin tools can be installed directly from that first run of the Visual Studio installer. And if you already have Visual Studio installed, you can relaunch the installer and add it in afterwards. Of course, just make sure you've checked off mobile development with .NET. When using a Mac, the first thing you should do is install Xcode. And you'll need the latest Xcode from the App Store, and this means you'll likely need the latest version of macOS installed as well. And then you can download the Xamarin Unified Installer from xamarin.com or install Visual Studio for Mac, and then go through the installation process. This is going to install Visual Studio for Mac as well as the Android SDK tools. And once it's finished, you'll be ready to start building Android, iOS, and Mac OS applications. Now, once everything is installed, you'll want to check for updates. On Windows, the Xamarin updates can show up via extension updates or full Visual Studio updates. And on the Mac, you can use the Visual Studio application menu and then select check for updates just to find any pending updates. Now, when you do the update on Mac OS, you'll see a dialog similar to this one, and it says two things of interest. So first, it shows you if any updates are available, of course. But second, it lets you change the release channel, and Xamarin has three of these. We have alpha, and this is where you'll find the latest version of the software, and this is often a little bit fragile, right? It's alpha version and subject to change as it evolves. There's beta, and this has the APIs locked down, but it still might have some issues, but the shape is not likely to change. And then of course there's stable, and this is the released tested version, and we generally recommend you use the stable version unless you want to test out some new features or upcoming APIs. Now, Visual Studio on Windows bundles early access features into Visual Studio Preview, and there's a download available to everyone. You can go to visualstudio.com/vs/preview. And the preview can actually be installed side by side with the stable version of Visual Studio, and this allows you to test out the latest things without breaking your dev environment. Now, we can do our development on Windows with Visual Studio even when creating iOS applications. However, Apple licensing requires that we build the app on a Mac, and this means that we can't do everything on the Windows side, and you'll need a Mac to actually do the final compilation. Now, Xamarin helps out with this, and they do this by installing a service on a network-connected Mac known as the Xamarin Mac Agent. Visual Studio can connect to this process and then delegate a portion of the build to this Mac, allowing us to compile with the native toolchain and even launch the Apple-provided iOS simulators. And this just means you'll have to have the Xamarin tools installed on this network-connected Mac. So here are the basics of how it works. When you create or open an iOS project with Visual Studio on Windows, the IDE attempts to connect to a Xamarin Mac agent. If you've already established a connection, it'll remember that connection and try and reconnect. And if it's unable or you haven't already set up a connection, then you'll be prompted to, connect to a build host. Visual Studio connects and interacts with your Mac using a secure SSH login. And this is actually important because remote login is typically disabled by default on most Macs, and so you'll need to do just a little setup before you can connect. Now, the connection wizard will walk you through the necessary steps to turn on remote login, and it's not too difficult. You're going to log into your Mac that you want to use and access the sharing preferences, as you can see here. Then select the checkbox next to remote login, and then make sure that your user ID is listed among the allowed users to remotely access this Mac. Once you've got your development environment set up and can build your app, you're ready to run and test it. And there are two options. You can install your application onto physical devices that you have in front of you, or you can run the software on simulated devices on your computer through the use of emulators and simulators. Apple provides an iOS simulator with Xcode, And the Xamarin tools create native iOS apps so we can use the same testing tools. The simulator can be launched with your application from either Visual Studio for Mac or Visual Studio on Windows using the build host. Now by default, the simulator always runs on the Mac, so if you use Windows to build your app, the simulator will actually launch on the Mac. This means you'll need access to that display and even the mouse and keyboard of the build host machine, either physically or even through some kind of remote desktop. And the simulator supports a variety of devices and resolutions as well as different versions of iOS, so it's a really fantastic way of testing. Now, Xamarin also provides a remoted iOS simulator for Windows developers, and this lets you view and interact with your iOS application right from Windows. Now your application still runs on your Mac, but it's visualized on Windows. Now the remoted iOS simulator is a separate download and it requires Visual Studio Enterprise. Now on the Android side, you've got a few choices, and the simplest option is to use the emulators installed with the Android SDK. Google supplies a set of emulator images called Android Virtual Devices, or sometimes AVDs. And they can require a couple of steps to get things optimized, but once you've got them up and running, they're quite fast and support a wide variety of device types and OS versions. Now, the best Android emulator experience is to install and configure the Google emulators using Android Studio, and that's Google's development IDE. This is not installed by Xamarin, but it is a free and separate download. So once you install Android Studio, you can create a new AVD image from the AVD editor, and this can be launched through a toolbar button on the Tools Android menu. Now you may need to create a dummy project just to get into the full menu, so just create any Android app and then delete it when you're done configuring your emulators. And finally, we have Windows. And on Windows, we have the Universal Windows Platform emulators, which ship with Visual Studio. Now, these UWP emulators have two types. There's Windows Mobile, which is Windows 10 on a phone form factor, and the UWP Desktop emulator. You might be thinking, why would I need a desktop emulator? I'm working on a desktop class PC for development. It's actually really useful. It's great for testing your application on different screen sizes, different screen densities, and to test things like rotation and gestures. This is an optional install, so make sure you select it with the Visual Studio installer. And the emulators do require Windows 10 with Hyper-V enabled. And Hyper-V is an optional install. If you have it installed, Visual Studio should turn it on when you install the UWP emulator, but if not, you can use the control panel to add it yourself. You should now be ready to start developing with Xamarin. Now, if you have any difficulty setting up your Xamarin development environment, we strongly encourage you to take the free live XAM101 class at university.xamarin.com. There, you'll be able to get assistance from an expert Xamarin University instructor who will be more than happy to help and answer any questions you may have.